All right. So I want to try to keep this quick. Sorry, it's not getting out as quickly as I would have liked. Around the time I started feeling a bit better, my wife got extremely sick. She's better now, as of this morning. So I was able to put this together. But I will try to keep it really short and just sort of go over the symbolism. There's a lot I would like to get into. This is a story that every time I come to it, there's more and more to find. It's one of the most elegant short stories, and considering what Chekhov has accomplished in so few pages is really incredible. So let's dive into the symbolism. So when you want to do a symbolic analysis of a story, the first thing that you want to do is kind of take inventory of the symbols and what one symbol is doing by itself. Is definitely it's a place to start as you're beginning to analyze, but real analysis is putting various symbols into conversation and trying to see the text as a system of symbols where as these symbols are brought into conversation with one another, deeper and deeper meaning, more and more elevated meanings begin to emerge from the interplay of symbols. And so each of the symbols that he's using are actually fairly simple and about as universal as it gets. Winter and fire, river and forest. There are few more universally used symbols since the dawn of literature. And then his use of a hill is really fascinating. And so what you want to do when you're doing a symbolic analysis is first take inventory of those symbols, and then if you don't already sort of have a feel for what the universal meaning for those symbols is, you want to look into that. And so we have winter and or the cold, we have fire, we have forest and river, and then we have the hill. So let's take a look at what those are universally speaking. When I say universally, I mean um, across literature, across cultures, are there similarities in how a symbol is used? So winter is a really great one. The experience of winter is universal all around the world. Everyone, to some degree, unless they're really close to the equator, experiences winter. And so, just sort of instinctually, we know that winter is associated with um, the cold, the disappearance of the green, as everything sort of dies. A really interesting um, symbol with winter, and the reason that we have Christmas trees as evergreen trees is long ago they would, as nature began to wither and die around them, folks would go and get boughs of evergreens, and they would kind of secret them into their homes, and they would hold on to them because they believed it was a way of conserving the life force of nature. So they would gather these green things, specifically evergreens, um, and they would kind of hold on to it as though it was sort of the spark of nature, nature's life, and then they would protect it, and then spring would come again, and life would be returned to nature and the foliage. And so winter is associated with hard times, and suffering, and particularly like suffering of kind of larger forces, right? We can't stop winter from coming. Ask the Starks. Um, and so yeah, winter is for lean times, and it's a time to kind of bunker down and conserve um, life force. Um, Fire. So fire is my favorite symbol. Fire is used in a variety of ways, but there's always sort of um, a fundamental symbol underneath all of its uses. Um, a lot of cultures have some kind of Prometheus story of how they gained fire. So obviously the story of Prometheus, it was stolen from the gods, brought to humans. Um, and fire, it's not just warmth. Um, Fire is sort of a representation of the divine in a lot of ways. It can be the divine in the sense of like like godly divine, but also like the spark of the divine within humans. Um, Fire is the thing that um, makes us what we are, makes us something kind of special. Um, Fire is so one interesting use of fire is among Zoroastrians. Zoroastrians have ever-burning hearths in their temples, and they have fires. And at the center of the temple, in the most sacred space, in the Sanctum Sanctorum, they'll have a hearth and a fire going. And this fire is ancient, and they have like fire keepers who keep this fire going day and night across the centuries. Um, and this fire sort of represents their faith, the divinity of the world, and it's sort of a taking of all that is divine and like sort of condensing it into a singular object is fire. And there's the fire within, the thing that sort of animates us. Back in the 1700s, there was a way of thinking of biology called vitalism, which was this idea that within all living things is this vital spark, and that's what accounts for the difference in animate and inanimate objects. Inanimate objects like rocks don't have this vitalistic spark, whereas things like humans and animals do. And so fire it's a relatively simple and easy to pick up symbol, warmth, life, but it can be used in a lot of really profound ways. River and forest. So here's where, if it hasn't already gotten weird for you, it's probably going to get weird now. So the forest universally represents the world, and particularly the wilderness of the world. Good example of this is in Dante's Inferno. So the first scene we get of Dante before he meets Virgil is he's in a dark forest, and he's beset by these dark animals like a wolf and stuff like that. And it represents him coming out of the world, because he has to leave the normal, the mundane world before you can go into the underworld. And so the forest often represents the world, like the physical world, the mundane plane of existence. And then one modification of that that's also really popular is the dark forest. And then the dark forest we know is the place of trials, the place that must be traversed to get to most often some kind of grail, some sort of object that is sacred, either objectively sacred like a holy grail, or like sacred to the pursuer. It's the princess in the towers on the other side of the dark forest or something like that. But the forest most often just represents the world. Rivers represent time most often, time or change, and sort of both at the same time. And so yeah, the river of time. And so forests represent sort of in a way space, the world of the universe of space and objects and things like that, whereas rivers are time, the time element of our reality. And so forests and rivers are sort of time and space, or space and time respectively. And the hill, we'll get to the hill in a bit. The one thing kind of to think about the hill is don't get lost in the hillness of the hill. It's more that the hill is an elevated place. It could be stairs, it could be a hill, it could be a mountain, it could be a soapbox. It's the thing that it is an elevated surface is really all that's going on there, which doesn't really gain a lot of meaning until it's kind of placed in the context of the story and the way that it shows up. So how do we see winter showing up? It's used pretty simply. It's just hardship and tough times, right? The story starts off and winter is coming. It starts off winter is sort of on the way, and then at one point he literally says like winter has arrived. And so that's all that sort of represents, but it's used, what it's alluding to in the story is kind of the universal suffering of human existence. Which brings us to fire, and fire is sort of the antithesis of that. It's the thing that, despite the oncoming of winter, humans have this fire. They can kind of gather around the fire and be kept warm, and kind of it keeps the cold and therefore the suffering of the world at bay a bit. It's still there, but the fire is the thing that helps us weather winter, weather the cold. Um, and so, obviously a lot of the story takes place around this fire. But it gets really interesting when you take a look at how the story is told in proximity to the fire, and in a lot of ways, because I'm trying to keep this short, I'm going to have to kind of like jump around a little bit. But what Chekhov's kind of doing is, by having this story be told around this fire and the way that the scene is playing out, it's sort of indicating that the story is like fire in the way that it keeps us warm, the way that fire keeps, I can't remember her name, but the woman at the fires, I think there's two of them, but the woman who's like really into this story, it is having an effect on her spirit. The story is that is the same as the effect of the physical fire on her body, way it's keeping her warm and stuff like that. Which is really interesting. This idea that it's the stories that help us transcend our suffering, and keep us warm against like the existential cold of the winter of the world. And through this experience, actually, let's backtrack a little bit. Let's look at before we get to the hill, let's look at how the forest and the river is showing up. What's really interesting is not the presence of the forest or the presence of the river, but the way that our protagonist is situated relative to them. So at the very beginning of the story, he is emerging out of the forest from a hunt, and he's a theology student. So what has he been hunting for? Well, literally, he's probably been hunting for, hare or squirrel or deer or something like that. But if he's a theology student, he's also an existential hunter, a spiritual hunter. He's hunting spiritual enlightenment. He's hunting, truth, knowledge of his God, knowledge of God's creation, whatever it might be. And so in a lot of ways, he is a hunter of both physically and spiritually or mentally or philosophically. So he's merging out of the forest, which indicates that he is stepping outside like the normal realm of the normal world, outside of the mundane plane. He's entering into this new space. And this space is situated between the forest and the river. And so as he's stepping outside of the forest, outside of the real world, he's also in this weird place where he's between, he's outside of space, but he's also outside of time because he's outside of the river. So as he's walking in this path between the two, he's in what's called a liminal space. A liminal space is a space between spaces. So a great example of a liminal space is the threshold of a door. If one were to stand in the threshold of a door, like if I were to stand in the threshold of the door behind me, am I in the hallway? Not really. Am I in the room? Not really. I'm in this really weird space. And to stand in the threshold of a door is an odd thing. It's not something someone does. And so liminal spaces are really interesting. And we're in liminal spaces a lot. You think of any time that you felt kind of like left out, of a friend group or a society in general. You're in this liminal space where you don't fit in where you're supposed to fit in, and you're just sort of floating, and you don't have like a sense of a lot of things. That's sort of a liminal space where there's a space that is one would typically be in, and in not being there, one is sort of unmoored to the normal rules of society or something like that. And so he's in this odd liminal space. He's outside of the forest. He's outside of space. He's also sort of outside of time. And so that's sort of where he is. He's this theologian who's just in this weird outside of space and time place. And so he's goes down the path, and he comes to this woman at the fire. And so this indicates transcendence, right? So this indicates outside of space and time, inherently indicates he's in this almost like not quite transcendent, sort of pre-transcendent space. He's in this weird place where interesting things can happen. So he tells this story, and then he has this blazing insight, which is really beautiful. He has this realization that sort of the universality of these stories and that through these stories we can glimpse sort of almost time travel in a way. Thought, but because blah blah blah, with her whole being was able to feel what went on in Peter's heart. So through the story of Peter, she came to know Peter in this intimate spiritual way. And this kind of sparks for him. And he says, suddenly joy stirred in his spirit. He even stood still momentarily to catch his breath. The past, he thought, is joined to the present by an unbroken chain of events proceeding one out of the other. So we're talking about this beautiful chain of being, of events through causality. All things are connected. So the deep interconnectedness of all things, which is universal in all spiritual traditions. If you get underneath almost every single religion, you find this appeal to the universality of the universe, that all things are unified in some way. They're the Buddhists say it's interdependent. The Christians might say, everything is of God. And so they all have different language for saying this thing, but this thing is universality. Everything's connected. Everything is one. I mean, even physics tells us this. Everything is quantumly entangled. Everything is interdependent from everything else. And so he has this huge, galaxy brain moment. It seemed to him that he had just seen both ends of that chain. So he's full transcendent now. He's outside of space and time. He's outside of absolutely everything. And he has the entire chain of being, and he's seeing both ends of it. As he shook one end of the chain, he was able to touch the other. So it's this beautiful moment where he's completely transcended into it's outside of space and time, outside of everything, and then he grabs the chain of being and begins rattling it, which is just incredible and mind-blowing when you really think about it, as being so in such a transcendent state of mind that you can see the entirety of the chain of being and you begin rattling it. It's such a beautiful image, and one that I think I've never read anything like it, anything like just so daring. As an artist, it's beautiful. So he has this experience. He rattles the chains of his own existence, which is interesting if you really want to dive in. I don't think we have time for, but to symbolize being as being chained. What do we associate with chains? Shackling, binding. And so that this idea that all things are sort of bound, and he, in my mind, I don't think this is what Chekhov's going for, but this is just my reading and me bringing, my way of thinking to it. But almost like he's rattling it as someone who was previously trapped within this chain. Now he's rattling it as someone who is shackled, let me out. Which I don't think is a bad experience. I don't think this is like a existential horror or anything like that. But I think it's such a complex and fascinating image, this just rattling the chains of being. Anywho, and then he immediately crossed over to the other side of the river. So now he enters back into time. He's going from the liminal space, crossing back into normalcy. So he's been outside of space and time. He's had this moment of divine inspiration, almost like this like trip that he's had, entered into a completely new dimension. He returns back to this world, and then immediately ascends a hill. So he's gone from this spiritual plane to the normal plane, ascends the hill, and now with this knowledge that he's brought back from this liminal space, he ascends the hill and experiences transcendence on that plane now, because he's in an ascended place. Anytime you have a character ascending, and especially here where then he's looking out, and you think when you see images from like the top of a mountain, you can see to the curve of the horizon. It's not a normal perspective. And you think of stories told by astronauts where they go into space and they see the whole Earth, and it just shatters them. It shatters their whole worldview, and all notion of nationality, all notion of any separation whatsoever among mankind is just shattered. And so that's sort of what he has here. He ascends this hill, and now with this new divinely inspired perspective, looks out enlightened over all things. And indeed, his enlightenment is mirrored in the rising of the sun, right? And it says, or the setting of the sun. The sunset's cold blood red glow stretching the narrow band across the edge of the horizon. And so this enlightenment is sort of this crescendo of a sunset. And he's able to see all of this beauty despite like it's winter. And he's even said like winter is here. We are in the depth of sort of the worst part of the world, all the things that winter brings, and yet he is only filled with joy and beauty and sort of the ecstasy of existence. And that's symbolized by him ascending the hill and then looking out. So elevated surfaces sort of represents that perspective, that elevated perspective that is able to see from as though objectively from above. So that's about all. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I have. It's a beautiful story. What do I want you to get from this for your own project? I want you to see that you can tell relatively simple stories on the surface and just focus on a few symbols. If you really like symbolism, pick 2 or 3 symbols that you feel an affinity with, in the way that I feel like a deep affinity with fire, and I try to work fire into a lot of the things that I do. Bring that into your stories. Your stories don't have to have high concept ideas and stuff like that. You can pick a few simple symbols and tell a relatively simple story. But because those symbols are so universal, just by placing them in the text, the reader, it deepens the story and gives the reader a lot of room to play and interpret. And so if you want to work with like a metaphor or something, I highly recommend it. And above all, keep the story simple. They don't have to be very long. They don't have to have action. They don't have to have all of the things that modern readers seem to want in things like TV shows and stuff like that. Short stories are very different. They can do relatively simple things and still be beautiful and profound. And so, do you have to write a story with the symbolic richness and depth that Chekhov, the grandmaster of short stories, has done? Absolutely not. Please don't put that pressure on yourself. But do you want to play with fire? Do you want to play with winter? Do you want to play with elevated places? Do you want to play with rivers and forests and stuff like that? Yeah. And there's an infinite array of symbols that you can bring into your work, and can be a starting point. You think, okay, well, I want to have a story where characters do this. Well, I could do a forest. I could have them be in a forest, sort of a dark forest, and have these things going on, and that instantly elevates the nature of the story. And so, yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed this. Hopefully it's inspiring. And yeah, I'll cut it there.